Okay, guys, in our last lecture, we were talking about the structure of matter and that to make certain molecules, we can have atoms that bond together through different types of chemical bonds. And we talked about the difference between covalent bonds, where atoms will share electrons in order to get that nice outer shell complete, or ionic bonds, where atoms will give up and completely take in electrons in order to get those outer shells complete. So that's kind of where we're going to start off today, or here in this lesson, about really specifically one type of molecule, but it's a molecule that is super important for life, and that is the molecule of water. So here we go. Here is a molecule of water, and it's a little bit more detailed than you might have seen in our last lecture. So here's what's going on. In our last lecture, we talked about the fact that water is built out of covalent bonds. And you may remember that that's because oxygen naturally has 6 electrons in its outermost shell, and hydrogen has 1, and this hydrogen over here also has 1 electron. So the way that they make sure that each atom in this molecule is happy is by sharing electrons. And they share those electrons, therefore they have what's called a covalent bond. But that's not the whole story. Water exists because of a certain type of covalent bond called a polar covalent bond, and that makes water a polar molecule. So a polar covalent bond is when atoms are sharing their electrons, but they're sharing them unequally. And the reason they're sharing them unequally is because typically one atom is larger than another atom. So therefore its nucleus, which is positively charged, has a much greater pull on the negatively charged electrons. It's kind of the same thing as planets and gravity. Like large planets have a really strong gravitational pull, and small planets not so much. It's not gravity at all, but it's kind of the same idea. So oxygen is this really, really, really big molecule, and hydrogen is much smaller. Therefore, when oxygen and hydrogen share their electrons, they share them unequally, and oxygen actually kind of hogs those electrons. And oxygen pulls the electrons closer to it, and hydrogen kind of loses its electrons just a little bit, not completely. The result of that is, since more electrons, more negatively charged particles are moving toward oxygen, the oxygen end of water becomes kind of negatively charged. And because those negative electrons are moving away from the hydrogen, right? We have those electrons moving away from the hydrogen toward that big oxygen, the hydrogen becomes a little bit positively charged. So water is what we call a polar molecule, and polar just means that it has a distribution of charge. In other words, one end of a water molecule is negative, and the other end of a water molecule is positive. Okay? So we call that a polar molecule, and it's polar because of the unequal sharing of electrons. Even though the electrons are being shared, they're being shared unequally. And the idea that one water molecule is held together by polar covalent bonds makes this next concept possible. And it is incredibly important for the way water behaves. Okay? Because, like we just said, oxygen has a slightly negative charge on a water molecule, and hydrogen has a slightly positive charge on a water molecule, something called a hydrogen bond can form in between water molecules. Okay, those dotted lines right there are represented by hydrogen bonds. So what's going on here is this oxygen up here, for example, has that slightly negative charge because it's hogging some electrons. This hydrogen down here has that slightly positive charge because it's not totally giving up, but it's kind of losing some of its electrons. And those two opposite charges actually then attract each other. Okay? So if you look at all of these water molecules here, you have the hydrogen of one water molecule bonding with the oxygen of another water molecule. You have the slightly positive end of one molecule bonding with the slightly negative end. And here's a slightly negative end bonding with a slightly positive end. And that same slightly negative bonding with this same slightly positive. Okay? So a hydrogen bond is how water molecules stick together with each other. Not how one water molecule is held together, but how multiple water molecules get held together. And it's because the positively charged hydrogen on one molecule is attracted to the negatively charged oxygen on another molecule. And you can see then, if you zoom out, kind of this cool picture here, when water gets together with a whole bunch of other water molecules, it's a very, very, very organized looking structure, because all of those hydrogen bonds arrange each other where the positive hydrogens are kind of attracted to those slightly negatively charged oxygens. And it's these hydrogen bonds that give water some of its really, really, really interesting properties that make it such a great substance for life to occur within. So now we're just, excuse me, going to go through kind of a list of some of those unique physical properties that water has. And just so that we're clear, all of these, if you ask yourself why does this happen, always go back to the fact that water can make hydrogen bonds. Okay? Hydrogen bonds make water unique. Hydrogen bonds give water these unique properties. So when in doubt, if the question is, why does this happen in a water molecule, or why can water do this, probably the answer is because of hydrogen bonds. Hydrogen bonds are pretty darn cool. So this diagram right here is showing the difference between two features of water: its ability to do what's called cohesion and its ability to do what's called adhesion. Okay? So there's this cool phenomenon that takes place in the fact that we know that water accumulates around the roots of a tree, but really that water is needed up in the leaves of the tree. Which means water, in order to keep trees alive, has to go up, has to go against gravity. And it uses a combination of cohesion and adhesion to do that. Okay? Cohesion is when one water molecule forms, and here's the hydrogen bond, to another water molecule. So that's water to water, bonding with hydrogen bonds. Adhesion is when a water molecule forms a hydrogen bond to something else. Okay, that's not a water molecule over here. It's something else. So cohesion is water bonding to water with hydrogen bonds. Adhesion is water bonding to something else with hydrogen bonds. In this case, the two of them work together because adhesion helps water molecules stick to the sides of these kind of channels, these tubes that are inside the trunks of trees. So this is just kind of a blown up picture of what's going on inside the trunk of a tree. So the adhesion helps the water molecules stick to the sides of those tubes, and the cohesion helps the water molecules stick to each other. So basically, we get this chain of water molecules all stuck to each other with cohesion, and all stuck to the sides of these tubes with adhesion, and they can kind of work their way up to the tops of the trees, to the leaves of the trees, thanks to those two properties helping them out. This is an idea of what we call the specific heat of water, and the fact that water is really, really, really resistant to temperature change, which means it has a high specific heat. High specific heat means it doesn't like to change temperatures. And this is just kind of a map, and it's a kind of fuzzy, I apologize, but a zoomed in version of the west coast of California. Okay, so you can see Los Angeles right here. And essentially what it's showing, that if you kind of draw a line straight across from Los Angeles toward the east, away from the ocean, the temperature differences that occur. So Los Angeles has this nice kind of cool, 75-degree climate. Then you go straight across on into Riverside, and you're in 96 degrees. And then you're getting out into the desert of Palm Springs, where you're in the 100-degree range. Okay, so basically what's going on here is because Los Angeles is located on the beach, basically, there's a whole huge body of water called the Pacific Ocean that is very resistant to temperature changes. It doesn't like to heat up, or when the weather heats up, the water absorbs a lot of that energy. Okay? Whereas over here in the desert, when the same amount of heat is occurring, when the same amount of sunshine is occurring, we get much higher temperatures. The reason is because, again, of hydrogen bonds. And the hydrogen bonds that hold all these water molecules together in the ocean, when sunlight shines on them and we get this heat from the sun, we get this solar energy, that energy has to do something first. Before it can heat up the atmosphere, it first has to heat up the water. And while it heats up the water, it has to heat up the hydrogen bonds. And heating up the hydrogen bonds just takes that much more time and that much more energy. Therefore, the overall temperature doesn't get very hot. It's the same reason why it takes a while for a pot of spaghetti to boil, or at least a pot of water to boil before you can dump spaghetti in it on your stovetop. Because the hydrogen bonds that are in those water molecules, they have to absorb all of that thermal energy, all of that heat energy first. Then once they have absorbed all the heat energy, then the water itself can actually start to boil. So water is very resistant to changes in temperature because those hydrogen bonds need to either be broken or need to be formed. So they kind of act as this little buffer zone that makes it so that water really doesn't change temperature very quickly. Another really cool feature of water, and it doesn't seem that cool, it's probably actually more annoying to you, is the idea that ice floats. Right? It's annoying because ice floats on the top of your drink, and then you go to take a drink of it, and you got to tip your cup at this awkward angle so the ice doesn't all come crashing down in your face. That's kind of annoying. It's actually good for life, though, because when a body of water, now I know here we just have a cup, but when a body of water like a lake, for example, freezes, all the ice stays on the top and allows liquid water to stay liquid down underneath, which means that the things that live in liquid water, the fish and the algae and the plants and all the things that are used to that aquatic ecosystem, don't freeze solid in wintertime. That's actually a good thing. Now again, what's the reason that water, when it's solid like ice, floats on top of water when it's a liquid? Well, it's because of its hydrogen bonds. And this is very, very rare, guys. Most solid things sink in the liquid versions of themselves, but water doesn't. Solid water floats on liquid water, and it's because of the hydrogen bonds. So when these water molecules slow down enough, which is what happens when you decrease temperature, the molecules slow down, they start to form their hydrogen bonds. Okay? But the hydrogen bonds actually push the water molecules farther apart from each other, and they make this kind of open space. Notice there's a pocket there, and a pocket there, and a pocket there. Whereas in liquid water, the hydrogen bonds are kind of constantly forming and breaking, and the water's just kind of spilling all over itself, and it's a little bit more chaotic. That chaos means tinier open spaces. Whereas when the water molecules slow down, the open spaces are much larger. The larger open spaces are essentially pockets of air that make the density of the water much less when it's a solid. And with less density, because the molecules are spaced farther apart, that's what causes something to float. Lower densities cause things to float. So hydrogen bonds push these molecules farther apart from each other and open up these greater spaces in a solid, in ice, whereas in liquid water, there's not as much space in between those water molecules. They're a little bit more unorganized and just tumbling all over themselves, so they're more dense, which means that ice can float on top. And that's really good for aquatic ecosystems so they don't freeze solid in the wintertime. And lastly, there's this idea that water is a really, really good solvent. Okay, a solvent means that water is a really good solvent. A solvent is something that can dissolve something else. So just some terminology here. A solvent does the dissolving. A solute is something that gets dissolved. And so getting dissolved just means breaking apart. So in this case, the solute is salt, sodium chloride, straight out of the salt shaker. Yummy French fries. Okay? The solvent is the material that the solute is sitting in and that will dissolve it, so that's the water. So solute is the salt, solvent is the water. Okay? Because of that idea, we talked about that water is polar, and it has positively charged hydrogen ends, right? And it has negatively charged oxygen ends. When water meets up with something like sodium chloride, which the sodiums are positive and the chlorides are negative, it will naturally want to break those things up. And you can see here all those positively charged hydrogens. See how they've arranged so that they're all facing this negatively charged chlorine? And on the flip side, see how all these negatively charged oxygens have arranged themselves so that they face the positively charged sodium? Okay? Therefore, the sodium and the chlorine split up from each other, so the salt will dissolve into the water. That makes the salt something called a solute, and that makes water, because of its polarity, its negative and its positive charges, a very, very good solvent.